My name is Diana Newby, and I'm 36 years old. I've been married to Ray Newby for 5 years together for 7 in total, and until recently, I would have told anyone who asked that our life was steady, predictable, and quietly good. We owned a comfortable house in the suburbs, split the bills evenly, argued about paint colors and grocery lists, and talked about children the way married couples do when they assume time will eventually cooperate. Children were always part of the plan, not urgently, not desperately, just inevitably, or so I thought. For the first few years, when nothing happened, month after month we treated it like bad timing. Then came the tests, the specialists, the polite clinical language that reduced our future to numbers and probabilities. Everything came back normal, which somehow made it worse. No explanation meant no solution. IVF became the next step, and I remember thinking that if we had to work harder for this, then fine, we would. Together. Looking back now, that word together was already starting to mean different things to each of us. The shift didn't announce itself loudly. It slipped in quietly disguised as happiness. Last spring, Ray attended an alumni event for his university. When he came home that night, he seemed lighter than I'd seen him in months. He laughed more easily. He kissed me absent-mindedly while checking his phone, smiling at messages he didn't explain. When I asked who he was talking to, he said, "Just old friends. You know how reunions are." I did know. I let it go. That was the first time my instincts whispered something I chose not to hear. Over the following weeks, his phone became an extension of his hand. He'd glance at it during dinner, chuckle softly while brushing his teeth, turn the screen away without realizing he was doing it. I told myself I was imagining things. Married people don't spiral over nothing. Trust is supposed to be automatic. Then his ex-girlfriend, Lauren Mitchell, started appearing in our conversations. It was subtle at first. Lauren used to love this place. Lauren always hated spicy food. Little comments that felt harmless in isolation but heavy in accumulation. It was as if he was narrating memories I'd never asked to hear, holding them up next to our life like comparisons he didn't realize he was making. Around the same time, our IVF conversations intensified and something about them began to feel wrong. Ray wasn't excited about us having a child. He was excited about having a child full stop. He talked about efficiency, about success rates, about minimizing variables. When I talked about what it would mean emotionally, about how hard this process might be on us, he listened politely and then steered the conversation back to logistics. I couldn't quite articulate what bothered me, only that it did. 4 months ago, the truth found me when I wasn't even looking for it. My laptop had died, and I needed to print a document before work. Ray's laptop was open on the desk. I wasn't snooping. I clicked the browser and hit the wrong tab. What opened wasn't social media or email. It was a detailed email chain with a fertility clinic I had never heard of located hundreds of miles away. The subject line mentioned storage status. I read the words once, then again, then a third time slower as my hands began to shake. Frozen genetic material. A previous IVF cycle. Storage fees paid continuously for 7 years. With Lauren. The timeline alone made my stomach drop. These payments stretched back before we met. Through our engagement. Through our wedding. Through 5 years of marriage. All quietly maintained. All deliberately hidden. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat there in absolute stillness, reading every message, every date, every carefully worded inquiry about consent and logistics. Then I took screenshots, backed them up to a cloud folder Ray didn't know existed, closed the laptop, and said nothing. Because somewhere deep down I already knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the question he hadn't asked yet, the one he seemed to be working up the courage to bring to the table. And when he finally did weeks later, sitting across from me at dinner, with nervous hands and rehearsed calm, I would be ready. He didn't know it yet, but by then I had already stopped hoping I was wrong. After that night, I learned how to live inside two realities at once. On the surface, everything continued as it always had. I asked Ray how his day was. We discussed bills. We watched the same shows on the couch, his arm occasionally resting on my shoulder, like muscle memory doing its job. If anyone had walked past our windows, they would have seen a normal, married couple moving through a normal evening. Inside me, something had gone very quiet. I didn't confront him, not because I was afraid and not because I was weak. I needed to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with. One hidden truth has a way of pulling other truths out with it, and I wasn't about to step into that conversation blind. So I watched. I noticed how often he checked his phone when he thought I wasn't looking, how his mood lifted after certain messages, then dipped when replies took longer than he expected. I noticed how Lauren's name came up more frequently, now slipped into conversation, as if repetition would eventually make it harmless. "She always said that too," he remarked once, smiling to himself. I didn't respond. I just nodded, filing it away. At night, when he fell asleep, I lay awake, replaying moments from the past few years that suddenly made sense in a way they never had before. The vague answers, the unexplained charges on our shared account that he'd brushed off as old subscriptions, the way he'd once casually mentioned years ago that he and Lauren had looked into fertility treatments before their engagement ended, never specifying how far that process had gone. I realized then how carefully omission can be weaponized. He hadn't lied outright. He'd just never told me the parts of the story that would have mattered. A week after finding the emails, I called a lawyer. I didn't tell anyone, not my friends, not my family. I framed it in my own mind as a consultation, not a decision, a way to understand my options if things went where I feared they were heading. The lawyer listened quietly as I explained the situation, occasionally asking for clarification, occasionally pausing to let the weight of what I was saying land. When I finished, there was a brief silence on the line. "You're doing the right thing by documenting everything," she said finally. "Whatever happens next, you need to protect yourself." That word "protect" stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I became meticulous, not obsessive, methodical. Screenshots of emails Ray accessed from our shared devices, notes about dates and times when he left the room to take calls, browser history that showed searches he clearly hadn't meant for me to see, questions about consent laws, donor agreements using stored genetic material from a previous partner. Each piece alone might have been explainable. Together they told a story he hadn't admitted to himself yet, let alone to me. What hurt the most wasn't the logistics. It was the realization that he had been planning a future that didn't include my full consent. He had already decided what our child's origin would be, already discussed it with someone else, already framed it as reasonable. I was the last person to be informed, and still some part of me hoped I was wrong, that there was a misunderstanding buried in the details, that when he finally brought it up, he'd frame it as a conversation, not a conclusion. Hope is a dangerous thing when it's fed by denial. The IVF conversations continued, but they shifted in tone. Ray stopped asking how I felt about the process and started telling me what made sense, what would be easiest, what would give us the best odds. He spoke with a confidence that suggested decisions had already been made somewhere else in conversations I hadn't been invited into. One evening, while clearing the table, he said casually, "We should probably talk more seriously about donor options." I looked at him then, really looked at him. His face was calm, almost rehearsed, as if he were easing into a script he'd been practicing in his head for weeks. "Okay," I said. He smiled, relieved, misreading my tone entirely. That was the moment I knew the question wasn't if he would ask, it was when. And when he did, I wouldn't react emotionally. I wouldn't argue hypotheticals or defend my worth. I would let him say it out loud. Because sometimes the most damning thing a person can do is explain themselves fully. Once the silence between us was broken, it couldn't be repaired. After Ray mentioned donor options, the subject hovered over our house like humidity, unspoken, heavy, impossible to ignore. He didn't bring it up again right away, but everything he said in the days that followed circled the same idea, like he was laying groundwork, softening the edges before delivering the real proposal. I noticed how often he used the word practical. Practically speaking, success rates are higher if you minimize unknown variables. Practically, it's easier if the genetics are already documented. Practically, we shouldn't let emotions complicate something that's already hard. Each time he said it, something inside me recoiled. He was talking about our future like a business decision, not a shared life. I started replaying our earlier IVF conversations in my head, now armed with the knowledge he didn't know I had. His enthusiasm hadn't been about building something with me. It had been about reaching a result he'd already pictured, one that didn't require me in the way a marriage should. The comparisons became harder to ignore. "Lauren was always very organized about this kind of thing," he said one night, not looking at me. "She kept meticulous records." I set down the dish I was drying and stared at the sink until my vision blurred. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did and chose not to care. There was a growing sense that I was being evaluated against a version of a woman who had never fully left his life. That our marriage existed alongside a parallel narrative, where she still played a role, quiet, preserved, frozen in time, just like the genetic material he'd kept without telling me. At night, I lay awake, listening to his breathing, wondering how long he'd been planning this. Whether the idea had formed gradually, or if it had been there from the beginning, tucked away behind reassurances and vows. I wondered if on our wedding day he had already known about those storage fees, if he'd already decided they were none of my business. The thought made my chest tighten. I drafted questions in my head that I never asked. Not yet. I wasn't interested in half-truths or rehearsed reassurances. I wanted to hear him say it plainly without me leading him there. And then on a Tuesday night that felt painfully ordinary, he finally did. We were eating takeout from a Thai place we both liked. The television was on muted. Ray barely touched his food. He kept checking his phone, then setting it face down like he was waiting for a signal to begin. "I want to talk about the baby stuff," he said, finally pushing his plate away. My heart started pounding, but I kept my voice steady. "Okay." He took a breath the kind people take when they think they're about to say something reasonable. "I've been thinking a lot about IVF, about what makes the most sense for us." There it was, for us. "I think we should use donor genetic material," he continued, "specifically the samples that are already in storage." I set my fork down carefully. The samples from Lauren. He looked surprised that I didn't need clarification. Then his expression shifted, not to guilt, but to relief. "You know about that," he said. "Good. That makes this easier." Easier. He launched into an explanation he'd clearly rehearsed. The genetics were known. The medical history was documented. Lauren was healthy, athletic, intelligent. No major hereditary issues. She'd already agreed to sign over all parental rights. No legal complications. No emotional involvement. "It's just biology," he said. "It doesn't mean anything beyond that." I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man in front of me with the husband I thought I'd married. "You want me to carry and raise a child genetically connected to you and your ex-girlfriend?" I said slowly, "while you've been secretly in contact with her for months, while you've hidden this from me for our entire marriage, and you think that doesn't mean anything." "You're making it weird," he replied, irritation creeping into his voice. "This is logical. You're letting emotions get in the way of a solution." I took a breath. The moment had arrived exactly as I'd imagined it. "That's an interesting request," I said. I walked to the hallway and retrieved the envelope I'd kept hidden in my work bag for months. When I placed it on the table between us, the words, "Petition for dissolution of marriage," were visible immediately. The color drained from his face. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. "Divorce papers," I said calmly. "I've been carrying them for 4 months, waiting to see if you'd actually go through with this." The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, I watched the version of our marriage he'd constructed in his head collapse under the weight of being seen. Ray didn't sign the papers that night. He stared at them for a long time, flipping through the pages as if they might change if he read them carefully enough. Then he looked up at me with something between disbelief and indignation, like I had violated an unspoken rule he thought protected him. "You planned this," he said. "You've been pretending everything was fine while you were setting me up." I almost laughed. Instead, I said I prepared for reality. "You've been lying to me for years." That was when the tone shifted. First came the apologies. He reached for my hand, his voice dropping into something soft and familiar. He said he loved me, said he never meant to hurt me, said he'd cancel the storage, immediately cut off contact with Lauren, do counseling, do anything. He framed it as a misunderstanding, a poorly communicated idea that had gotten out of hand. Then, just as quickly, the apologies turned to accusations. "You're punishing me for having a past," he snapped, when I didn't respond. "You've been looking for an excuse to leave. You just don't want a baby as much as I do." I didn't engage. I gathered a few things and moved into the guest room that night. I told him I wouldn't be sharing a bed with him anymore, that the conversation was over. He didn't accept that. At 10 o'clock, I heard him on the phone, pacing the hallway. By 11, there was a knock at the door, hard, urgent, entitled. His mother. She'd driven 40 minutes in the dark to fix the situation. I knew that before I even opened the door. She didn't greet me. She demanded, "How dare you ambush my son like that, after everything he's done for this marriage?" I let her speak. Then I said evenly, "Everything he's done includes secretly maintaining frozen genetic material from his ex-girlfriend for 7 years, reconnecting with her behind my back, and asking me to raise a child that isn't ours, while pretending it's practical." Her face cycled through shock, confusion, and then settled into something colder. "That's not how he explained it," she said. "It's just a fertility solution. You're being emotional." "I'm being precise," I replied. "There's a difference." She waved her hand dismissively. "It's just genetics, like a donation. You're reading too much into it." That was the moment I understood this wasn't just Ray's delusion. It was inherited. I told her I'd be staying in the guest room while we sorted out living arrangements. that the conversation was over. Then I closed the door. From behind it, I could hear her voice rise, telling Ray I was cold, unfeeling, vindictive, that she'd never trusted me, that this proved I never truly loved him. The next few days were unbearable. Ray swung between remorse and rage like a pendulum. 1 hour he was begging me to reconsider. The next, he was accusing me of destroying our family over nothing. His mother called repeatedly, leaving voicemails that grew more hostile by the day. His sister texted me once. He made one simple suggestion about fertility options, and you responded with divorce. You're actually unhinged. I didn't reply to any of them. I saved everything. Screenshots, voicemails, dates, times. I forwarded it all to my lawyer. Because somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't the worst it was going to get. I just didn't know yet how far Ray was willing to go to prove he was right. 4 days after the dinner, I came home from work and knew something was wrong the moment I opened the door. The house didn't sound empty. There were voices in the living room, low, careful, polite in a way that made my stomach drop before my brain could catch up. I set my bag down slowly, every step toward the sound feeling heavier than the last. When I turned the corner, I saw them. Ray was sitting on the couch. Across from him, holding one of my mugs, was Lauren Mitchell. She stood up immediately when she saw me, her expression flickering with discomfort. Ray followed too quickly, as if movement itself might diffuse what he'd done. "Diana," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "We just wanted to talk. Clear the air." I looked at him, then at her, then back at him. "You invited her into our house," I said quietly. "Into my home." "I thought if you met her," he said, already defensive, "you'd see this isn't romantic. This is just about the baby, about giving us options." Lauren cleared her throat. "I don't want there to be any misunderstandings," she said carefully. "I'm in a serious relationship. I'm not trying to get back together with Ray. This was never about that." I almost laughed. Almost. I turned to her. "Did he tell you I didn't know about the stored material until 4 months ago?" She hesitated, just a beat too long. "He said you were working through some resistance," she admitted. "That you'd agreed in principle and just needed time." My eyes snapped back to Ray. "I never agreed to anything I said. I found out you'd been hiding this from me for our entire marriage. That's why I filed for divorce." Lauren's face changed completely. What she asked, looking at him. "You told me she knew. You told me you'd talk this through." Ray opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since this began, he had nothing rehearsed. "I thought if you both talked," he said weakly, "it would help her understand." "Understand." Lauren stood up slowly, setting the mug down with shaking hands. "You lied to me," she said flatly. "You said this was mutual, that she was on board." "I never was," I said, "and I never will be." She looked between us, then shook her head. "This is messed up," she said. "I didn't agree to be part of this. I'm leaving." She didn't look at Ray when she walked out. She didn't say goodbye. The door closed behind her with a finality that felt earned. Ray turned to me, desperation flooding his face. He started explaining how he thought if I saw Lauren was normal, non-threatening, reasonable, I'd change my mind. How he believed bringing the woman whose genetic material he wanted me to carry into my living room would somehow fix everything. The level of disconnect was breathtaking. "I'm done," I said, completely. That night, something inside me settled. The anger cooled into clarity. Any lingering doubt dissolved. This wasn't confusion or poor communication or desperation for a child. This was entitlement. And he would burn everything down before admitting he was wrong. I thought the worst of it was behind me. I was wrong. A week after Lauren left my house and Ray realized he'd lost control of the narrative inside these walls, he took it outside. I didn't know that at first. I found out the way most people do now through a slow, disorienting shift in how others speak to you. Friends stopped checking in. Messages went unanswered. Invitations quietly disappeared. When people did reach out, their tone had changed, careful, concerned, vaguely judgmental. Then my phone rang. It was a cousin of Ray's, someone I'd always gotten along with. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she said. "Ray told us you refused to consider donor options at all and flew into a rage. He said you've been hiding fertility issues and taking it out on him." I felt something hollow open in my chest, not surprise exactly, but confirmation. That night, the messages started coming in faster. His aunt, a mutual friend from the neighborhood, someone I barely knew from a holiday party years ago, all asking variations of the same question. Why was I throwing away my marriage over my ego? Why was I punishing my husband for trying to solve a medical problem? Ray's version was neat, polished, easy to swallow. According to him, I had serious fertility issues I'd been hiding out of shame. When he lovingly suggested donor genetics to help us have the baby we both wanted, I became unstable, controlling, cruel. I filed for divorce because I couldn't handle my own inadequacy. He cast himself as patient, rational, heartbroken. I didn't respond publicly. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself in group chats or social media posts. I did exactly what I'd been doing since the beginning. I documented. When people reached out directly, accusing or questioning, I corrected the record quietly. I sent screenshots, dates, email threads, proof of storage payments going back 7 years, messages showing Ray had been coordinating this plan long before he ever mentioned it to me. Not everyone apologized right away. Some people went quiet. Others doubled back sheepishly within hours. One message stood out. From his own cousin. Holy crap. He told us a completely different story. I'm so sorry. This is insane. The tide turned slowly but decisively. Ray didn't take it well. When his version of events stopped sticking, he escalated. He started telling people I'd fabricated evidence, that I was twisting his words, that he'd never specifically wanted to use Lauren's genetic material. I'd just assumed that because I was looking for an excuse to leave. The gaslighting was relentless. What he didn't understand was that denial only works when there's ambiguity. I had none. The emails were explicit. The questions he asked the clinic were detailed. The logistics he researched were specific. This wasn't interpretation. It was documentation. His mother went quiet for several days after someone in the family confronted her with the discrepancies. His sister stopped texting altogether. The people who mattered, the ones capable of critical thought, saw the truth clearly enough. Ray, meanwhile, seemed unable to stop himself. Every attempt to rewrite the story only revealed how deeply committed he was to not seeing what he'd done. That was when I realized something unsettling but freeing. He wasn't lying to protect himself from others. He was lying to protect himself from the truth. And once someone reaches that point, there's nothing left to salvage. 6 weeks after Ray first slid that practical solution across the table, the divorce was finalized. No dramatic courtroom showdown. No last-minute confessions. Just paperwork, signatures, and a judge who had seen enough versions of this story to recognize it immediately. The house went on the market and sold faster than either of us expected. After the mortgage was paid off, we split the equity down the middle. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was fair. Our retirement accounts were divided according to the length of the marriage. We each kept our own cars and our own debt. No spousal support. The judge didn't even hesitate. Ray looked stunned when it was over, like he'd been expecting the universe to step in at the last second and reward him for believing hard enough. What surprised him most, I think, was that I didn't look relieved. I looked tired but steady. During discovery, the last pieces fell into place. Communication records had to be disclosed to establish timelines. That was when I learned Ray and Lauren hadn't just been texting. They'd met in person at least 4 times. One of those meetings happened in a hotel in a city 2 hours away on a weekend he told me he was attending a work conference. I didn't need proof of anything physical. In a no-fault state, it wouldn't have changed the outcome anyway. But the confirmation mattered to me. It explained the ease with which he'd crossed lines, the confidence, the entitlement. This had never been just about IVF logistics. It had never been just about a baby. It had always been about her. I shared that information with exactly one person, Lauren's current partner. He deserved the truth. A few weeks later, he reached out to thank me. Ray had explained those meetings away as closure and support. The messages and hotel records told a different story. They broke up shortly after. When I heard, I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph, just distance. Ray lost his marriage. Lauren lost her relationship, and the frozen genetic material they'd preserved so carefully was still sitting in storage, quietly accumulating fees, tied to a future that would never exist, an emotional anchor with nowhere left to attach. In the weeks that followed, Ray sent one final message from a number I hadn't blocked yet. I hope you're happy. You ruined everything because you couldn't handle a simple request. I didn't reply, because by then I finally understood what he still couldn't. The request wasn't the betrayal. The betrayal was the 7 years of deliberate hiding, the months of secret contact, the rehearsed lies, the willingness to decide my future without my consent, the expectation that I would shrink myself, rationalize his behavior, and accept whatever scraps of honesty he chose to offer as long as I stayed. He thought I was afraid of being alone. What he never understood was that I'd already been alone for a long time. These days, my house is quieter. The silence doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels honest. I don't wake up wondering what's being hidden from me. I don't parse conversations for inconsistencies. I don't brace myself for revelations that arrive disguised as logic. Some people will always tell this story with me as the villain, the cold wife, the woman who couldn't handle reality. I've made peace with that. The people who matter know the truth. I know the truth. And if there's one thing I learned from all of this, it's this: preparation isn't cruelty, it's self-preservation. When someone shows you consistently, quietly, and repeatedly